Okay, we're back with part 2, and I'm open up here. I've got Arc Catalog open, and the data, I want to first look at my C drive here. So let's expand that, and we'll find our folder. If it will expand here for me. Okay, it's expanded. We want to go to the GIS-110. Let's expand that. Look in Project, look under Gila, GIS Data, and let's look in our base data folder, and we'll go to the vector data, and let's first look at the one I'm interested in. Let's look at that federal lands layer, the boundary data for that. And you can see it here. You can see it's got the text file. That text file is going to have some metadata information in there for you, which is really important documentation to give you the projection and so forth of that. And normally you would open those kinds of files outside of Arc Catalog, but since they used to wouldn't even show those kinds of files here, but since they're showing it, I'm going to see if it will open for me. Yeah, there we go, because I want you to see, and notice that it did open in Notepad, which is great. I wanted you to see what it looks like, and this is real typical of a metadata layer you'll find from federal data as well. I mean, especially because it's sort of a standardized format, and it's not that user-friendly to read through, but you'll see enough of it over time that you'll become familiar with it. Sometimes you have a nice little summary of table of contents at the top with hot links that jumps you around the document, and then that'll be like a Word file or something, and those are much more user-friendly. This one being a raw text file, everything is just kind of thrown in here without any formatting, like no bold, nothing's bolded or anything like that, much less hot linked. But it's at least indented, and so you can scroll through it, and it gives you information about the layer. A lot of this kind of stuff you will have already found on the site that you downloaded it from, so that's nice, and you'll probably have already read this. And at this point you would probably, your main interest is probably going to be what is the projection that this data exists in, because we're going to have to define this projection. And I'll show you why in a minute, or how you can at least tell that. But I'm curious what the projection is, so I'm going to scroll through here, and a lot of the words you're looking for, the key words, this spatial domain, okay, that's getting you closer. And I had paused this for a minute and went to my edit and find, and just look through spatial and scroll through the document that way. And here is the key information that we're looking for. And it's like, you know, finding a needle in a haystack. But remember this word, the spatial data organization. And in worst case, just look for spatial, or look for spatial reference information, because that's really what we're wanting. Okay, and that's probably the best keyword to remember. And that way you can find it quicker, and you can see it was actually in the middle of this document. But here is our all-important projection information, and it's telling us that this is using a geographic projection, okay, and that we have a datum of North American datum 1983. Those are your two key pieces of information that you need with any of your data files. Now, if you're lucky, like in the book and with a lot of the data that I provided you on the sample data, but not all of it, as you can tell, this one is not, but a lot of the data will already be defined for you. And if you remember from 101, defining a data is the first thing you have to do with your data layers in using Arc Catalog, to basically associate the projection that that data exists in with a file that ArcGIS can recognize, so it will know how to treat that data. Because ArcGIS, if I had just opened this layer up in ArcMap and it wasn't defined, you would get the all popular warning sign about it not being defined. In fact, while these are open, I'm going to go ahead, and I normally discourage you from opening ArcMap and Arc Catalog at the same time, but just so you can see this for the sake of example, I'm going to show you in ArcMap what it looks like if you happen to try to pull in a data layer that has not been defined. And this will explain why I think you want to look at it with Arc Catalog first. Okay, so I'm having to do a voiceover here, by the way. We go in and open up the federal lands shapefile, and we get this warning about unknown spatial reference. And what this is basically telling us is that that data layer has not been defined. In other words, ArcGIS or ArcMap doesn't know how to open that data in a way that it can associate it with its spatial reference. So if it happens to be that that spatial reference is the same as what we're using for other data that we might have in our project, we could say OK, and it will go ahead and open correctly, and it would look fine anyway. But really and truly, there would be a problem there, especially when we come to doing some kind of analyses or things like that, because ArcMap wouldn't really know how that data is defined. So that's why we have to go through and define the data, and that's why we need to know what projection it is in currently, because without that information, we're just lost. We can't identify how that layer is referenced. So it's pretty critical to get this information. I've seen a lot of students that will go ahead and open these layers in ArcMap and work with them, and they just get lucky that they happen to line up. But more often than not, this is the #1 source of problems for students that are trying to get their data to open up and or to line up, I'm sorry. And so here I went ahead and said OK, and you'll see that it pulls it in, and but again, it doesn't know the reference information that goes with that. So it's not the way we want to do things. We first really should have looked at this data in Arc Catalog to see if it had been defined or not. And that's what we'll do here in a minute, is open it up in Arc Catalog, and I will show you how to define a layer as well, which is something you probably learned in the 101 class, but and just in case, we'll go through that process and do that. So we need to know the projection that the data is currently in, not necessarily what we want it to be in, but what it is currently in. So that's why we went through the metadata a little while ago and did that. You can see again we're dealing with geographic and North American datum of 1983. So we'll close that and we'll go back into Arc Catalog here. And normally I don't have ArcMap and Arc Catalog open at the same time, by the way, and I would discourage you from doing that. I did it in this example to make a point, but we go into Arc Catalog and we see our data. We narrow down our list to the layer, and we can do a couple things. We can go in here and look first to see if there is any metadata with that. Another way, and this is not something you'll use right away, you have to kind of know what you're looking for, but I could go in with just regular Windows Explorer and look at that layer, and there's always at least 3 files that goes with a given layer in ArcMap, and a lot of these are sort of behind the scenes, but you have in addition to the shape file, you have a DBF and an SHX file, and there's our text file that we use for the metadata. But those 3 files at a minimum, but one that's missing is a .prj file. And that PRJ file is, if you go back to this on your own and look in your folder after we get through defining it with Arc Catalog, which I don't do in this video, but it's easy enough for you to do on your own if you wish, you'll see that there's a PRJ file in there. So that's what we're basically doing, is creating a PRJ file with Arc Catalog. Now I apologize, my video recording program zooms in automatically to parts of the screen, and sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. So I apologize there for it zoomed in there. But I had went to the description tab, which used to be in the old ArcGIS that I like, or was used to, I should say, was this was an easy way to see your metadata. And I'm still working with it in the ArcGIS 10. But they've changed things a little bit. But basically, even though we had that text file of metadata, ArcGIS is not seeing it with the default that it's using now for the description information. So we don't see any information here. It does not see a projection, at least that it knows about. So we're going to go in and define one using the toolbox. So we want to go ahead and click on the toolbox here in just a minute, and the toolbox takes a little while to open. The first time that you're using it in a session, but just be patient. And okay, it takes a little while, you notice, for the toolbox to come up the first time you use it. It seems like once you've used it the first time, though, at least in that same session, it comes up quicker. I guess it has to load in memory. But now that toolbox is up, the tool that we want to use for defining a projection is found under the Data Management Tools. And you scroll down to the set of tools that goes with projections and transformations. And here you'll see the defined projection. Notice there's a feature and a raster set of tools, and not to confuse you, but I wanted you to see that there's some subtle differences. Under feature there's a project tool, and under the raster set of tools there is a project raster tool. Both of those tools are if you're actually going to do a reprojection. So it's a little confusing on the name. Just ignore those for now. Usually what you're wanting to do is just define your projection, at least initially. And so we'll select the Define Projection tool, and it pops up here. And then we can input the data set, which is that federal lands layer, by selecting the drop down and selecting it from the list, or you can alternatively drag it in there and drop it as well. Either way, it's a little quicker to drag and drop sometimes. And then this is the other way that we know that the projection has not been defined, because it says unknown here. If there was any other projection in here, we'd get a red notice up here and it wouldn't let us define it. It would let us reproject it, which is what you can do after you define it, but it wouldn't let us define it. In this case, it is indeed undefined, so we have to select the projection. And this is where a lot of people get confused. You don't want to select the projection that you want it to be. You have to select the projection that it's actually in. And that's why we looked at the metadata earlier to find out what projection that data set is in currently. And that's very, very important. A lot of people make a mistake here and they'll select the projection they want. But you have to select the projection that the data is actually in, and the only way you know that is from looking at the metadata. And if it's not in the metadata, then hopefully it's on the site page somewhere that you downloaded it from, because you have to have that piece of information. So there are ways of trying to guess at it, sort of intelligent guessing if you don't have that. But it's much easier if you have that information. So since we know, if you remember, the projection was in geographic, it was a geographic coordinate system, and it was set to 1983 datum. So we simply go to the select, and we have a choice between either projected systems or geographic systems, and it was in geographic. So we double click that, and we have a whole set around the world that we can choose from. The ones we want is in North America, of course. If it had been a WGS-84 and you had gotten this off of a GPS unit, for example, you might want to go with the world, because that tends to be where the 84 datum is, just to let you know. So we're going to North America, and we want the North American 1983. And the one we want is just the plain old 83, not the one that's got the any of the core information or anything like that. We just want the 83. So we select that and then add. Now, before I do that, sometimes your data will be in a 27 projection, and again, you would want just the plain old 27 in that case. There are a couple other options, but 99 out of 100 times, in my experience at least, has been that you would want just the plain one. So we'll go with the 83 this time. That's what it was in. Add that, then we'll apply. Give it a minute, and it should come up in the bottom. This is a little slower in ArcGIS-10, I've noticed, but it will eventually come up on the bottom with a little pop-up that lets you know that the projection has taken place, or the defining of the projection has taken place. And again, it's a little slower in ArcGIS-10, so you have to be patient and wait for that. There's a tendency to want to rush on and go on to other things, and you might lock up your system there if you do that. So give it just a minute, and it should pop up with that. It's taken quite a while on my end, and I think what might have happened is it might have popped up on my other screen and I didn't catch it. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and if it has run, it will clear the box. OK, I'm sorry. Yeah, I say OK there, and then you have to say OK one more time. This is the dialog that you're actually waiting on, and it will pop up in a minute and say projection has been defined. And again, this might pop up in my other window, and I don't know if I'll have time to drag it over fast enough. Or you can see it at the bottom here running. So it's running the tool while this blue thing is scrolling here. And when it finishes on the lower right, it actually popped up on my other screen, and it won't let me drag it over. But it would appear in the lower right of your window, and it would say define projection, and you know it's ran then. So again, you can see it on my screen here because I've got two monitors, and it is running on my default monitor. So we've run that. Let's close the toolbox, and we should have our projection is defined now. So it's still not showing up in the description, again, because we don't have a metadata file that is showing up with this, but it has been defined. We ran the tool, and if we wanted to know for sure, we could always go in and try to rerun that tool, and if it had been defined, it would actually show up in the toolbox this time instead of saying unknown. So we've got that, so we can close. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and close Arc Catalog to save time. I believe all of my other layers have been defined, but in your case, when you're first running this kind of thing and looking at your data, it's always a good idea to scroll through and look at some of the other data layers just to see if they have been defined or not. And like we could check the wilderness real quick since we've got it here handy. We could drag it in there just like we did the federal lands layer, and it pops up here with a coordinate system, and you've got the little yellow warning feature, so it's basically telling you not to define it again because it's already been defined. So we're good to go on that, and I'm pretty sure we're good to go on most of the other layers. I believe I've already defined those, so we'll go ahead and just proceed with the example. We close Arc Catalog, and let's bring back the Arc map. Now pause it a minute while we're waiting on it to boot up. Okay, everything looks like it's booted up again. Okay, it's opened up on my end now. Let me move it. It opened on my other screen. Let me move it over here. Yeah, trying to. Here we go. Okay, I've got Arc Catalog open, and what I always encourage students to do is to explore your data with Arc Catalog a little bit before you actually start pulling it into ArcMap. I've already looked at some of this data, so I'm not going to do that with every layer, but one of the layers I noticed had not been, the projection had not been defined, and so I wanted to use that as an example of a good reason why you'd want to look at it in Arc Catalog first, and then go ahead and define it live while you can watch, and in case you would like a refresher on how to do that. And in my case, I have already hit cancel on the dialog box that popped up because it was on my other screen. It was the box that lets you choose the last project you worked on or browse to a new one. And in this case, we wanted to start a new one, so I just clicked cancel, and we've got a blank format here. So let's load some of our data, and let's load that federal lands layer. How about that we defined a minute ago? We'll add that in, and notice we don't get a warning this time, which is good. The extents of this is very large, you can see, so most everybody's projects, I believe, was in the lower 48, so we're going to just go ahead and zoom in here a little bit, and you can see a little better here. You can see the range of federal lands, of course, the bulk of them being in the western U.S., but you can see that we have federal lands distributed all over the country. And what I'm going to do for my area, I know it's in New Mexico, and just to make it a little easier to do, actually, let's go ahead and load the states layer first. That might make it a little more straightforward. So I'll load the, go into the sample data, and remember I had, and this would actually be better off moved into the boundary layer if you caught that. But since it unzipped from sample data, I didn't drag it over yet. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to pull it and use it from this folder for now. But let's go ahead and drag the states in there. And you can see the state layer coming up. And we know, in my case here, that, let me just drag this on top so it's a little better visual. And we're interested in New Mexico in my case, so I'm going to scroll in to the extent of New Mexico. And you can see all of the federal areas in New Mexico, a lot of them in the southern part of the state. Now we're interested in the Gila Wilderness in this case, so I could find that in this federal lands layer. but I'm going to go ahead and pull the wilderness area data over in a minute. But let me just open the attribute table for the federal lands to kind of give you an idea of the scope of information that's in that. You can see there's nearly 50,000 records in that database, so it's quite large. But again, it contains all of the federal lands layers in data for the U.S., so it's very handy. And you could pull out of this just the wilderness areas or just the one you were interested in. But what would happen is there would be several other Gila related things, because there's a Gila National Forest and the Gila Wilderness, and I might forget a piece of the puzzle there. So that's part of the reason I'm going to go ahead and use their data. But using the tools, the selection tools, like you've learned in some of the chapters from the book, you could actually search for the Gila Wilderness in this table. And another confusing thing, though, is sometimes they'll have wilderness in more than one column. Like you can see, you've got Feature 1 and Feature 2, and if I scroll through these, you'll begin to see some stuff in Feature 2 periodically. And you can see, looking over at Feature 1, here's a wilderness area, and it's in a national monument. But now I've noticed occasionally I'll see wilderness popping up in the other features as well. So it can be a little tricky to find all the wilderness areas. So to be safe, I'm going to go ahead, and this gives me a good feel for the distribution of the federal areas. And if you were working with one of the areas that's not a designated wilderness, then you would need to find it in that federal lands layer, because you won't find it in the wilderness layer. But since the Gila is already a wilderness, let me go ahead and add that wilderness layer here. And I'll add that, and you can see we've got a lot fewer of those when we zoom into that area. And now let me go ahead and open that attribute table, and you can see we've got for Feature 1, they're all wilderness areas. And then another neat thing about this database is it has a web link, a URL link to information about that wilderness area. And usually it's on like a National Forest homepage or something like that. Some of them have expired or dead links now, I've noticed, but most of them are still good. And then under the name, you've got the actual name of the wilderness. And you'll notice just right here at the top, there are several with the same name. And that's because they're different polygons that represent one area in some cases. And because that might be the case for the Gila, rather than just scrolling, what we could do is we could sort this list and then scroll down it and see how many there are for the Gila. There's only about, there's about 1,350 records, or 1,359. So, that's not unreasonable. But since we've got the handy selection tool, let's just go up there and select that and select by the attributes. And because we have that layer selected currently, it knows we're looking in the wilderness layer. If not, we would want to select that. And then let's just, for the name, let's just scroll down here till we get the name, and we'll double click that. We'll just build a little quick query here that looks for the Gila. So we can say name equal to, and we could type it in here, but we might make a mistake on typing, or we could just say click on get unique values, and it will pull all of those values over there for us. Now if we had typed it, we'd want to remember to put a single quote in there like they've got on this list here, because when you're doing a SQL query on a text field, you have to have a quote around it. So we'll go in here to scroll up to, let's see if we can find the Gila here. I must have passed it. There we go. And I'll double click that, and that builds my query. I can apply that, and it will go through the table and select the records that match the Gila. So I can say OK. And in this case, it looks like it did select just one record. I'm going to change my selection here to show me just selected records. And there is the Gila. And in this case, again, it was only one polygon for the Gila. And so that made it nice. We can close this table a little bit more and move it around. And you can see on the map here the ring glowing blue around the Gila. And it looks like there's another area here very close to it. And out of curiosity, let me just check that out. And you click on that, and my dialog box popped up on the other screen, so let me move it over. And we can see that's the Aldo Leopold Wilderness. So, what happened is some years after designation of the Gila, actually relatively recent years, they designated another block that would have been part of the Gila, but there's a road between the two areas. So, and they named it, I thought very fittingly, after Aldo Leopold. So that's not part of the Gila officially, even though it's very, very similar ecosystem and they're tied almost adjacent to each other. But now that we've got the Gila selected, we can go ahead and pull out we can create our own shapefile just for the Gila out of that larger set of files from the wilderness areas. Since we have it selected already, if I go over here and right click on the wilderness layer, there's an option down here that says data, and I can go out here and export data, and what I can do is export that out as a shapefile, and that will end up giving me a file just for the Gila. Now let me go back and do that one more time so you can see this. I'm going to export data, and then I want to export selected features is set already for me because it sees a selection in my data, so that's good. And I'm going to go ahead and keep it in the projection that it's using. It's already been defined. I don't know exactly what that projection is, but I'm guessing latitude and longitude from looking at the bottom of my arc map here, but since that was not the first layer I loaded, I could be wrong. But it's been defined already. We know that, or it wouldn't have lined up correctly, or it would have given us a warning when we loaded it. But by default it's routing it to another folder. We want to change that, route it to our working folder, which I've got on my C drive, and I go to the GIS-110 in project, Gila, GIS data, and in this case it's something that I'm creating. It's not necessarily what you could call it base data, but since I'm creating it and I created it from some base data, I'm going to go ahead and route this to the mark folder. And since I created it, and I'm going to store it under the vector folder, and then I'm just going to call it Gila, and I'll say BNDY for the Gila boundary, and that will let me know. And I don't want it to be a geodatabase. I'd rather it be a shapefile, so I'm going to change that setting to shapefile, and that's just by choice. If you wanted to build geodatabases, like I said earlier in the instructions for the assignment, that's perfectly fine. I like working with shapefiles, and I think it's a little more straightforward when I'm doing examples and things like that. So I'm going to keep it for now, in this case, a shapefile, and we'll just say save. And then say OK. And it will export it and ask us if we want to add it to the map, which we do. So I'll say yes, and you'll see that it popped up a layer just for the Gila. I can turn off my other wilderness areas and federal lands, and you can see that it does indeed just show the one spot, which is nice. And so now I've got a boundary for my actual wilderness area to work with. So it's kind of a long way of telling you how to do that, but that's a very handy way to narrow it down and pull out a boundary just for your area. Now you might have logged online and went to a website and found a boundary already for your area, and that's perfectly fine, but this is another way of getting to that if you haven't. So we'll pick up in a minute. I will show you how to look at topo indices, and we'll figure out which topo quads cover that area next.